And we are live. Welcome,
All
everybody. This
right.
is the spiritual discussion about Star Wars by Bo. And take it, Bo.
Thank you. All right. So this discussion tonight is going to be on the spiritual aspects on the Force. So let's get this started. On to the next slide. We'll start by discussing in general what is the Force. It's described in the movies as an energy field made up of all living things. And it's the direct power source of what are called Force sensitives. Force sensitives specifically are individuals that are born with what are called midi-chlorians in their blood. Specifically, midi-chlorian would be a direct conduit to the Force itself. More than anything else, you kind of see this in modern-day religion where they, more often than not, in terms like blood is the life and so on and so forth, these specific individuals are connected directly to the Force through the midi-chlorians. It's made most prominent, I would say, in Episode 1, where Anakin had a very high midi-chlorian count, and we'll be talking about that later specifically, but um, to give you an idea of how rare this is, in the Star Wars universe, we're literally talking about trillions and trillions and trillions of species and people. The Jedi Order at its most prominent was about 10,000 members. So consider, like, if we're doing the math itself, we're talking about probably around 1% or somewhere around there of people that would actually have this direct spiritual connection. So from there, that's the Force in general. And the one thing that's really not talked about in the movies themselves is there's four aspects of the Force. And this is what they're talking about when they say bringing balance to the Force. There's the unifying Force, the living Force, the dark side, and the light side, with the ultimate goal of being them all balanced on a scale themselves in order to bring balance to the Force and the universe as a whole. So we'll start with the unifying Force.
Can you tilt it
The
just a
unifying,
little bit more to the left?
my left or your left? Like this way
That way,
or
yeah.
this way? This way?
Your left. No, you're right. Oh, God.
Okay, my right. So right here?
No, more to the left.
Your left or my left? I can't. That way?
That way. That
Okay.
way. Yes.
Tell me when.
Yeah, a little bit more. A little bit more. Okay.
Okay. All right. The unifying force was kind of a smaller type belief movement. Specifically, what it was it views the force itself as a deity and not as an entity. In regards to, they would kind of review the force itself as God, like kind of like with the transition we have modern day, where some people consider source itself to be God. It would be the same generalized idea. So what we're looking at, as far as the unifying force itself, it concentrates on preordained destiny. The Chosen One prophecy was in the unifying force era, as well as, more than anything else, you're looking at past and present events, either themselves in memories or through visions themselves. And also with the unifying force, we're talking about all the intangible areas of the force. So anything that's not matter would be considered part of the unifying force itself. And that would be anything in science regard to anything in metaphysical viewpoints as such. It would be like all ethereal matter more than anything else. So directly from there, we're going to go on to the living force. The living force you hear most often talked about specifically in the movies themselves. They'll say he has much to learn of the living force, stuff like that. Famously in episode 1, Qui-Gon Jinn said this about Obi-Wan Kenobi on one occasion. And then from there, the living force It's described as the here and now where it belongs. And along with this, what we're looking at too is the living force would most likely connect with the teachings of Friedrich Nietzsche, where you were living in the moment itself. Directly, the present is all that matters directly from anything else. You are living in the present. And so, like I was referring to Qui-Gon Jinn with Obi-Wan Kenobi in episode 1, he said to him specifically, keep your thoughts here and now where it belongs. Along with the living force too, there is two other aspects that connect to it called the cosmic force and the physical force. I'm going to get into those a little bit later when we get farther down the slideshow. But the living force as itself, it literally views the force itself as all things, not as a deity, unlike the unifying force that we previously talked about. Now we move on to what everyone loves these days, the dark side of the force. Specifically, what we're looking at with the dark side is it almost always exclusively depended on the selfishness of an individual. So specifically with that, the Sith, who were kind of like the spokespeople for the dark side of the force in this universe, concentrated on power. And it also, with the philosophy, the power itself came from the hatred of an individual. The idea was hatred would give you power. Even so, in the Sith hierarchy itself eventually got to the rule of 2, but prior to that, what we were looking at was it was almost exclusively expected that the apprentice would lust for the power of the master until the point that they would execute them. That's what we were looking at. So literally, even going in as an initiate, you were expected to crave power so much that you would overtake the teachings of your mentor. And like I said, that's where it all comes back to selfishness. Unlike the light side of the Force, which was selflessness, this was the Jedi Order, specifically. And with that specifically, the light side was always working for the betterment of society itself. More than anything else, this is why the Jedi were ambassadors for the Old Republic in himself, and then in later works, the New Republic, which is like more of the expanded universe of the entire series itself. But they were always civil servants more than anything else, and unlike hatred and power, this order concentrated on love, compassion, and hope for society as a whole. All right. From here, we talked about the Jedi and the Sith. There were other aspects that were practiced by the Force themselves. I don't know if you can see that quote, but this is from an expanded universe work specifically said by Luke Skywalker, and he describes the Force as such. The Force is a river from which many can drink, and the training of the Jedi is not the only cup which one can catch it. And this, in many ways, looks at our modern day society. We all view spirituality in a different way, and like Luke says right there, we all drink from a different cup. So, while there was Jedi and Sith, there were several different other organizations too, like for example, there was the Night Sisters. The Night Sisters were like essentially witches that used the Force for their power, specifically the dark side. All the other witches on that same planet just simply went by the Witches of Dathomir. With that specifically, most of the regular mainstream witches concentrated on the light side itself. Other organizations, just as some examples, because throughout the entire works there are several, there was the Jin Seirai, which were at their heart considered themselves to be Jedi. However, they used Sith tactics. There were the Sorcerers of Tund, which was an off-branch of the Sith. Specifically, they concentrated on the Force itself more as magic and sorcery, as in just generalized manipulation. And then, of course, from there on out, there was the Potentium. The Potentium was a breakaway order of the Jedi themselves. Specifically, what we're looking at with the... excuse me. Excuse me. The Potentium was a breakaway Jedi Order. They were considered essentially heretics, but what they looked at was they considered the Force itself under the unifying Force theory. They considered the Force to be a god. And with that specific, they considered all relationships, actions, words, etc., established to be a path towards good. So no matter what situation you were in, they considered this to be something as a positive. So the Potentium followers were specifically known for kind of having friends in the Star Wars universe that most Jedi wouldn't facilitate themselves with. Like, they would meet people willingly who they knew were corrupt, but they considered it a good type situation. Most of them, more than anything else as mentioned, they were followers that unifying Force, but they concentrated on that to the point where they ended up joining this. The Potentium in the works of the novels ended up getting exiled from the Jedi Order, and this was about probably about 177 years before A New Hope, and they're only in the novels very briefly in a book called Rogue Planet, which is a early prequel adventure. Specifically, they had started a whole society on a planet where they concentrated on the Potentium, and almost all the citizens on this planet, which was a living planet, were Potentium followers. In contrast, another order that we're looking at was the Way of the Dark. The Way of the Dark was an opposite view of the Potentium, but with an expansion. Specifically with that, the Way of the Dark said, specifically that any act of darkness continuously would bring about prosperity. So, for example, followers of the Way of the Dark considered Emperor Palpatine to be a failure because he did two very specific negative actions. He took over a government through corruption, and then he destroyed the Jedi Order. However, from then on, he just went about ruling it, kind of like viewing it as a way towards peace. The only thing was he was aiming for peace instead of causing more trouble. So in their point of view, that was why he lost his power. He wasn't spreading more darkness. He was just going about his regular duties, and then everything fell apart. From then on, we're going to go back to the Force itself. And a question that was kind of asked to me a lot when I was first learning about this was, did the Force ever manifest itself besides the basics of living in all human beings? And the answer is yes. Specifically, what we're looking at was the Force manifested itself in the vision of the planet Mortis. Mortis itself was the avatar of the Force. It was the Force embodied, and it was a planet itself encapsulated. I don't know if you can see it too well, but it was inside this monolith right here. And we'll talk a little bit more about Mortis in just a few minutes because it does have some importance to this talk, but Mortis as a whole was the Force. Obi-Wan Kenobi said that himself. He said the planet itself is the Force. The Force itself really didn't manifest after that, but it did have some representatives that were higher beings, specifically the 5 priestesses. The 5 priestesses themselves each were representative of an emotion: serenity, anger, confusion, joy, and sadness. What they did specific was much like a chakra exercise. Each one, in order, would put you through a test with the idea of once you passed each test, you had achieved the teachings of the living Force, and from then on your consciousness was permitted to live in every moment. Specifically, this was how Qui-Gon Jinn ended up becoming a Force ghost, as well as Yoda and Obi-Wan Kenobi after him. And then after Anakin died, it's presumed that he went through the same trial, and that's why we see him at the end of Return of the Jedi. Strong representatives of the Force as a whole lived on the planet Mortis. So what we're looking at here is, in my opinion, a vast allegory to the teachings of the Mithras cult. So these individuals were called the Ones, and they were each a representative of the Force itself. So the daughter was the representative of the light side, the son was representative of the dark side, and then the mediator in between, who would be like Mithras in this situation, was the father, who was their actual father. And all these siblings did, literally throughout their entire existence, was battle each other, with the father putting them in his place. When we encounter them in the Clone Wars series, what we're looking at is the father himself does believe in the Chosen One prophecy, which we'll come to in a moment. And with that, excuse me, he wanted Anakin to take his place on the planet Mortis so he could continuously keep the Force itself in balance. While these two were going at it back and forth, I don't want to ruin the episode for you folks, but I would say spiritual-wise, it's actually kind of really in tune to what we're talking about right now. So we have the mediator, which is the father, the son, which represents the dark side, and the daughter, which represents the light. These specific individuals were not Force sensitive. They were what was called Force wielders, which was in itself individuals who literally could manipulate the Force at every nook and cranny that a Jedi or Sith couldn't. Like specifically the daughter and the son were both shapeshifters, as well as full-on beings. However, they were limited. They couldn't leave the planet itself without standardized transport. In the entire episode arc, the son himself is trying to get off the planet by means of a starship just so he can spread darkness throughout the galaxy. And now we come to probably, in my opinion, one of the most, I would say, things that a lot of people don't understand, even as fans of Star Wars, and that's the Chosen One prophecy. So what we're looking at from here is the first mention of the Chosen One prophecy actually predated Star Wars. This was in one of the original drafts of Star Wars itself, which originally had the working title of Journal of the Wills, after its prefix, which was The Adventures of Luke Starkiller and his adventures across space, something along those lines, from the Journal of the Wills. The Wills in the Star Wars universe are like the historians. All they do is observe, and then they write it down. So specifically, I don't know if you can see this quote at the bottom. This is from the Journal of the Wills, and it says, "And in the time of greatest despair, all shall come to a Savior, and he shall be known as the Son of the Sons." With that, above that, we have the original, as the works say it, we have the original text from the Chosen One prophecy. Now, this predates the Battle of Yavin, which happens in Episode 4, by about 27,000 years. And what it says specifically is, "In the time of greatest despair, a child shall be born who will destroy the Sith and bring balance to the Force." Now, what's important about this prophecy right here is it's knowingly mistranslated. And they kind of go into that a little bit inside Episode 2 when they say we actually don't know what it means. Specifically, what they know about it is that line, "who will destroy the Sith," it's known to be mistranslated. They don't know what the original translation was. It was just kind of thrown in there over time. So we, of course, have seen that in modern-day works of spirituality and religion. But what's interesting about it is
right, that sounds familiar.
They know that it's... Yeah, what's interesting about it is they know it's mistranslated, but they just kind of left it in there and just assumed that at the end of the day that was the prophecy. So we're looking at literally a prophecy that is looked upon by the Jedi Order that has 5 words in the middle of it that don't belong there, and they just kind of left it, and they were like, all right, it's okay. And so that's what kind of leads to the corruption of Episode 2 and 3. From there, what we're kind of looking at is Anakin himself was prophesied to be born. He was conceived by the midichlorians. And how that went about specifically is mentioned in the novels itself. Darth Plagueis, who is mentioned in episode 3, was the master of Darth Sidious, and he learned how to manipulate midi-chlorians. And at one point in the novel, him and Darth Sidious literally reach into the Force and mess with midi-chlorians and turn a large amount of them dark and spread them throughout the galaxy. Likewise, what happens as a result is the Force reacts to it. And we look at that even in modern-day quantum physics today. With every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So what happens is they spread darkness into the galaxy, and as a result, the Force reacted and conceived Anakin in his mother, Shmi Skywalker. From there, what would bringing balance to the Force actually mean? As we mentioned with the four-way scale earlier, it would mean an even amount between those four aspects of the Force that we talked about. So what that would mean is an even distribution of selfless and selfish acts. So that individual would be directly in the center. Or I should say individuals, because it consists of everyone once this happens. So they're not completely selfless. They're not completely selfish. They're directly in the middle. They're working for the prosperity of everyone at that point. Also, too, what happens is time kind of really doesn't matter at that point, as opposed to past and future with the unifying force, and then present with the living force. At that point, all of it seems to merge together, and all is one. So that's what bringing balance to the Force would mean in the Star Wars universe. And that is my presentation, people.
That was awesome.
Thank you.
Cool. I wanted to
That was
talk
really
awesome. A little bit
Good
more
job,
about
Bo.
that. I'm really interested in the midichlorians. I have just like a basic understanding, and I want to understand them more. Are they kind of like, would you call them like kind of chi or prana, or what would it be equated to, do you think?
From some of the stuff I was looking across, I would say they're most like, it's with George Lucas, it's kind of like back and forth, because he says a lot of stuff, and it seems every few years he changes his outlook on the series. But I did see chi in there when I was looking it up. I did see yin and yang. Midi-chlorians was more often than not his trying to explain why there were certain people who could literally touch the Force and there was others who couldn't. And that was really the gist of it.
Cool. Yeah, I hadn't really ever paid attention to that until lately, and then I was like, hey, this sounds kind of familiar. It sounds like the kind of thing that we talk about on a kind of quantum level, so I've been more interested in learning about that.
In the books, it literally kind of goes away from the religious aspect in the Darth Plagueis novel, where he's kind of like a Sith scientist. And that's like kind of really, it really brought a lot of purpose to Anakin's birth, where it talked about him spreading evil throughout midi-chlorians and the Force reacted. But no, it was cool.
Does anyone have any questions or insights or ponderings? They're like, eh.
Everyone's like, eh.
I mean, like I said, I like the. I've never read the books, of course, but I like the movies, and I mean, I've never gone that deep into the different themes or anything like that. They always been kind of surface for me, and so yeah, this is really cool. It just makes you look at them a different way, and yeah, I'll have to rewatch them and look for different elements that I was missing, because I'm sure there's plenty.
I don't have the quote with me, but I do remember, I think I posted it, but George Lucas said when he created the Force, he was kind of looking for a non-denominational viewpoint of spirituality as a whole. And then when you actually read the whole full page on it, it literally broke it down piece by piece. Like I mentioned, the Mithras cult was in there, Yin and Yang was in there. Yoda himself is based on a Buddhist monk.
Oh, right. We hardly
Emperor.
touched on Yoda. He's very, yeah, he's a very recognizable type of monk energy,
hmm
Buddhist energy.
And what becomes interesting about Yoda in at least on the Clone Wars series is he's an individual throughout the whole hero's journey arc is the mentor. However, in the Clone Wars series, towards the end of it at least, he's actually the student, and you see a little bit of that in episode 3. They cut out the dialogue, but in the last initial scene before they give the babies away, you see Yoda meditating, and what's in the original dialogue is actually Qui-Gon Jinn's instructing him, because Qui-Gon has become one with the living force. He can live it in any moment, and his consciousness is preserved. So that was a nice little kind of like roundabout that they did. Was you have this older Jedi who is essentially becomes one in every moment directly, and he's teaching one of the individuals that taught him. And then we see that in episodes 4, 5, and 6 when you have the Force Ghosts.
As someone who's read the books, are there any elements in them that you feel like really should have gone into the movies? Like it was like any travesties there, like that you feel they missed?
Well, what was really interesting was we had pretty much ever since 1977, the expanded universe started. And so we're looking at, what is that now, like over 40 plus years of works. And then when Disney bought out the new franchise, they pretty much said it was all invalid. And even so, some of the examples I used, like the Potentium and the Way of the Dark, aren't considered canon anymore. However, I thought, for purpose of the discussion, it was at least something to look at.
Right.
But yeah, it's kind of disappointing because there is some stuff that's, as far as spiritual, that I didn't even go into, that's in the expanded universe, like the whole thing about Luke Skywalker talking about the Force being drank from a different cup. That book that it came from, the title escapes me, but it was literally a whole book about different people who went about researching the Force.
That part stuck out to me. Can you say that again about the analogy of the cups?
Yeah, let me get the exact quote. Let's see. Wow, I didn't realize this slideshow was this slow. Okay. Luke says, "The Force is a river from which many can drink, and the training of the Jedi is not the only cup which can catch it."
I love that.
It's so true,
I
yeah.
really like that. Wow. Yeah,
But yeah, like
I'll
I
have to
think it was in that initial book too. Like there was this one species called the Phalaenacea, and they were literally like humans, except for they had a third or a second cornea, and they had rainbow-colored hair. And they called the first the White Current, and they believed it was literally like a river that was flowing through everything. And that was like just one way of looking at it, which in certain ways is like the chakras.
Right. Yeah,
A
that's what it
certain
makes me
way.
think of. And even just the way we all manipulate energy differently too. You know, you have all sorts of different healers, and we do. A lot of us do things very differently, but it's all the same. It's just a different way of
Mm-hmm.
manipulating it and being a channel for it. So yeah, I'll have to look that quote up again. I'll write it down. That's a good one. I like that. Michael, you're a Star Wars fan. What? Come on.
I'm just listening.
Come out of your artist cave.
Did you read any of the books, Michael?
No, I never read the books. Just seen the movies plenty of times, but never got into the books.
Did you ever read the comics?
Just a few. That was a long time ago, though.
Cool.
Yeah, I just never got around to it.
Yeah, they just started the new series of comics, so those have gotten pretty interesting just because they're pointing towards the new movies.
Yeah, I really want to read
And
those.
keep in mind, too, folks, I have to say this, just based on what I've seen in the previews, as soon as this next movie comes out, everything I just said could be completely invalid.
Oh yeah, please remind us how many hours now. You haven't said your count today, so.
It's 5 days still.
You don't know the hours and the minutes?
No, I don't. If that was the case, it would be like, what time is it? 8:48. Like 4 days, 3 hours and 12 minutes.
Well, we could go ahead and stop the broadcast now and then just talk casually, whatever, afterwards. And so yeah, thanks for putting that together. Maybe you could put the PowerPoint up somewhere for people to access it. That would be really cool because I would really love to see those images
See if I can
in the
post it
way
on
you put it
Facebook.
together. Yeah, I saw some of the images and I really liked them, and I think that would be a cool resource for people to have. Maybe we could put it up. I don't know, Dropbox or something like
Did
that.
anyone else have any questions before we cut the broadcast? All right.
No one's gonna ask no one's gonna ask the most stereotypical question about Star Wars. You know which one I'm talking about?
Oh, who shot first?
Well, that's not spiritual, so we won't even go there. Okay, well, thanks everyone for watching, and I hope you enjoyed.
Thanks for